My name is Jane, and at 67 I never expected to start over after losing Richard, my husband of 45 years. When his will was read, our son Thomas inherited a luxurious Miami penthouse while I got just an old cabin. My daughter-in-law Alexandra smirked and later mocked me, calling me a stinking old woman before having security escort me from their home. Desperate and alone, I drove to see this cabin. What I discovered there changed everything forever. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe as I reveal what happened when I turned that rusty key. Richard and I were college sweethearts. We met during freshman year when we both reached for the same book in the library. His smile captivated me instantly, and within weeks we were inseparable. Our wedding was simple, but perfect. Just 50 guests in my parents' backyard with wildflowers I had picked myself that morning. We didn't have much money, but we had dreams bigger than our bank account. Those early years were lean but filled with love. I worked 2 jobs to support Richard as he built his commercial real estate business from nothing. I taught elementary school during the day and waited tables at night, coming home exhausted, but fulfilled knowing we were building something together. Richard would often stay up just to see me when I returned from late shifts, waiting with a cup of tea and that same captivating smile. When I became pregnant with Thomas, our only child, we were overjoyed. Richard painted the nursery himself pale blue with little clouds. He would talk to my growing belly every night, telling our son about all the adventures they would have together. The day Thomas was born was the happiest day of our lives. Richard cried when he first held him, promising to give him the world. I set aside my teaching career to raise Thomas. It wasn't even a question for me. I wanted to give him the attention and love I believed every child deserved. Richard's business was still growing with many uncertain months, but we managed. I clipped coupons, sewed Thomas's clothes, and made every dollar stretch. Thomas was such a loving child. He would bring me dandelions from the yard and declare them the prettiest flowers for the prettiest mommy. Every Mother's Day, he would wake me with burnt toast and orange juice, his face beaming with pride at his creation. Those memories sustained me through the harder times. As Thomas grew, Richard's business finally took off. He specialized in developing commercial properties that revitalized struggling neighborhoods. People started referring to him as having the golden touch. We moved from our tiny starter home to a comfortable house in a good school district. Finally, I didn't have to worry about making ends meet. Thomas excelled in school just as we had hoped. He was bright, charming, and determined. Richard began taking him to construction sites on weekends, teaching him about the business. I would watch them return home covered in dust, but glowing with shared purpose. I thought then that we had succeeded in raising a son who understood the value of hard work and family. Richard insisted Thomas attend the best schools. Education is the one thing nobody can take from you, he would say, so Thomas went to Princeton for his undergraduate degree and then Harvard for his MBA. We were so proud, even though these prestigious universities took him farther from home than I would have liked. It was during his MBA program that Thomas met Alexandra. She came from a wealthy New York family and had the polished perfection of someone who had never worried about money. When Thomas first brought her home, she seemed genuinely interested in our family. She asked questions about how Richard built his business and complimented my home cooking. I started dreaming of grandchildren and extended family gatherings. Their wedding was extravagant, more like a coronation than a marriage ceremony. Alexandra's family insisted on hosting it at an exclusive country club, with 500 guests, many of whom we had never met. I felt out of place in my carefully chosen dress that had cost more than any piece of clothing I had ever owned. During the reception, I noticed Alexandra spent more time networking with Richard's business associates than celebrating with Thomas. In the years following their marriage, I watched as Alexandra's true nature emerged. Her initially warm demeanor toward me cooled considerably. Our Sunday dinners became monthly, then quarterly events. When they did visit, Alexandra would check her watch repeatedly, always having some important engagement to rush off to. In his final years, Richard became more secretive about certain aspects of his business. I noticed him taking private calls and attending meetings he didn't discuss. When I asked, he would kiss my forehead and say, "Just making sure everything is in order, my love." I didn't press him, trusting that after 45 years of marriage he had his reasons. Then came the diagnosis that shattered our world. Pancreatic cancer, advanced stage. The doctors gave Richard 6 months, maybe less. I became his full-time caregiver, administering medications, preparing special meals he could barely eat, and holding him through nights of pain. During one lucid moment near the end, Richard squeezed my hand and said something that puzzled me. "Jane, things aren't always what they seem. Trust my planning." When I asked what he meant, he just smiled, that same smile that had captivated me all those years ago, and said, "You'll understand when the time comes." On a quiet Tuesday morning, Richard passed away with his head on my shoulder and my hand in his. His last words were, "I've loved you completely, Jane." And just like that, after 45 years, I was alone. Thomas flew in for the funeral but stayed at a hotel despite my empty guest room. Alexandra complained about having to reschedule an important charity gala. I was too numb with grief to be hurt by their behavior. That would come later. 1 week after the funeral, we gathered at the office of Mr. Patterson, Richard's attorney and longtime friend. The office was everything you would expect from a high-end law firm: rich mahogany paneling, leather-bound books lining the walls, and a conference table, so polished I could see my reflection in it. The air felt heavy with anticipation. Thomas and Alexandra arrived 15 minutes late. She wore a designer black dress that seemed more appropriate for a fashion show than a will reading, complete with diamond earrings that caught the light with every movement of her head. Thomas was in a tailored suit that probably cost more than my monthly expenses, his attention divided between his ringing phone and the proceedings. I had chosen a simple navy blue dress Richard had always liked, with the pearl necklace he had given me on our 25th anniversary. My hands kept fidgeting with those pearls throughout the meeting, drawing comfort from their familiar smoothness. Mr. Patterson began with formal condolences and then proceeded to open Richard's will. The document was substantial, which didn't surprise me given the size of Richard's business empire. The attorney cleared his throat and began reading in his measured professional voice. "To my son Thomas Richard Williams, I leave my Miami penthouse apartment valued at $3.5 million along with its contents." Thomas nodded, as if receiving his due, while Alexandra squeezed his arm with obvious satisfaction. Mr. Patterson continued, "Additionally to Thomas, I leave my collection of luxury vehicles, including the Bentley, the Mercedes SUV, and the classic Jaguar E-Type. I also bequeath to him my investment portfolio managed by Blackstone Group, valued at approximately $7 million, and my art collection appraised at $1.2 million. With each item, my confusion grew. While I never expected an equal distribution between Thomas and myself, the clear imbalance was startling. Richard and I had built everything together. Where was my security in this plan? To my beloved wife, Jane Elizabeth Williams. Mr. Patterson paused momentarily, making brief eye contact with me, before continuing, "I leave our family cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains." That was it, a cabin. A property I had visited exactly once 30 years ago for a weekend getaway. A rustic structure that Richard had inherited from his own father, but had never shown much interest in maintaining. Alexandra turned to Thomas and whispered something I couldn't quite hear, but her smirk told me everything I needed to know about her thoughts on my inheritance. Thomas didn't meet my eyes, instead studying the expensive watch on his wrist. "Is that all?" I heard myself ask, my voice sounding distant, even to my own ears. Mr. Patterson gave me a strange look, one I couldn't quite interpret. "The remainder of the estate goes to Thomas as specified in the document. However, Mrs. Williams, I would like to speak with you privately after we conclude here." Alexandra immediately stood up. "Thomas and I have dinner reservations. Whatever needs to be discussed can be shared with the entire family, correct? We have no secrets." Her tone made it clear this wasn't a question, but a demand. Mr. Patterson hesitated but nodded. "Of course. The formalities are concluded. I just wanted to go over some details about the cabin property with Mrs. Williams. She can figure out how to turn on the rusty faucets herself." Alexandra laughed, the sound brittle in the formal setting. "Come, Thomas. We're celebrating at La Mer tonight." Thomas finally looked at me. "Will you join us for dinner, Mom?" Our treat, of course. Before I could answer, Alexandra interjected. I only made reservations for 2 at the chef's table. Perhaps another time. The dinner at La Mer was as uncomfortable as the will reading. Alexandra dominated the conversation, detailing her plans for redecorating the Miami penthouse and hosting parties for Thomas's business associates. The restaurant's dim lighting couldn't hide her triumphant expressions. You know, Jane, she said between sips of $100 wine, downsizing is really appropriate at your age. A simpler life with fewer possessions to worry about. The cabin might be perfect for your retirement years. Thomas spent most of the meal on his phone, excusing himself twice for urgent business calls. I barely touched my food, a knot forming in my stomach that had nothing to do with hunger. As we were preparing to leave, Mr. Patterson appeared beside our table. Mrs. Williams, a moment, please. He slipped a sealed envelope into my hand. Some information about the cabin. Please review it carefully. Before Alexandra could interject, he nodded politely and disappeared back into the restaurant crowd. That night, I returned to the house Richard and I had shared for 20 years. It felt emptier than ever, filled with memories and questions. I placed Mr. Patterson's envelope on my nightstand, but couldn't bring myself to open it. Instead, I held Richard's pillow, trying to make sense of his decisions and fighting the creeping feeling that after a lifetime together, I might not have known my husband as well as I thought. The weeks following the will reading were a blur of grief compounded by confusion. I tried calling Thomas several times, hoping to understand Richard's decisions, or at least maintain our relationship. His responses grew increasingly brief. Mom, I'm heading into a meeting. Can't talk now, big client waiting. Alexandra and I are at an event. I'll call tomorrow. Tomorrow rarely came. After 3 weeks of excuses, Thomas finally invited me to see their new Miami penthouse. I spent hours preparing a small housewarming gift. A handmade quilt I had been working on for months. I wanted them to have something personal, something that represented the family Thomas came from. The building was breathtaking, with a marble lobby staffed by uniformed doormen and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Biscayne Bay. I felt underdressed, despite wearing my nicest outfit. The elevator required a special keycard to access the penthouse floor, a detail Alexandra mentioned twice during our ascent. The penthouse itself was something from an architectural magazine. Soaring ceilings, walls of glass, and a terrace with an infinity pool that seemed to merge with the ocean beyond. Alexandra conducted the tour like a museum guide, emphasizing the cost and exclusivity of everything from the Italian marble floors to the custom furniture. This chandelier was hand-blown in Venice, she said, pointing to an elaborate glass sculpture hanging above the dining table. The waiting list is 3 years, but Thomas knows people who expedited it for us. When I presented the quilt, Alexandra took it with 2 fingers as if it might contaminate her designer outfit. How? Homespun, she said immediately, setting it aside on a chair where it remained for the duration of my visit. I never saw it again on subsequent visits, and suspect it was discarded before I even left the building. During that first visit, I overheard Alexandra speaking to someone on the phone in what she thought was a private conversation. Can you believe it? The old lady got some pathetic cabin in the mountains while we got everything that matters. Richard knew exactly what he was doing. Now we can finally stop pretending and live without her constant presence. The words stung like physical blows. Thomas had been within earshot but made no move to defend me or challenge his wife's characterization. His silence was perhaps more painful than Alexandra's cruelty. Financial reality soon added to my emotional distress. I discovered that Richard's pension would not continue for me, something I had mistakenly assumed. The house was paid off thankfully, but property taxes, utilities, and daily expenses quickly began depleting my modest savings. When I tentatively broached the subject with Thomas during one of our rare phone conversations, his irritation was palpable. Mom, Dad left you the cabin. You can always sell it if you need cash. Alexandra and I have our own expenses to manage with the new property. During that call, Alexandra suggested in the background loudly enough for me to hear. Tell her to get a part-time job at the mall. Plenty of stores hire senior greeters. I was 67 years old and hadn't worked outside our home in decades. The suggestion wasn't just insensitive, It was completely detached from reality. Thomas's birthday arrived and I was invited to dinner at their penthouse. The gathering was clearly not centered around family celebration. Alexandra had invited several couples, all connected to Thomas's business or her social circles. I sat at the far end of the table, barely included in conversations that revolved around yacht purchases, exclusive travel destinations, and property investments. "Jane is living in that charming old house still," Alexandra announced to the table during dessert, as if introducing an exotic specimen. "She's traditional that way. Aren't you, Jane?" A woman with obviously artificial features nodded sympathetically. "My mother was the same way. Couldn't adapt to changing times. We finally had to move her to a senior community for her own good." "How thoughtful of you," I managed to reply, clutching my water glass to steady my trembling hands. Another guest, a man with unnaturally white teeth, leaned toward me. "Memory issues are so common at a certain age. Do you still drive, Jane?" I was 67, not 97, but the group seemed determined to cast me as decrepit and dependent. What hurt most was watching Thomas adopt their attitudes, laughing at thinly veiled jokes about aging and referring to my neighborhood as where time stopped in the 80s. The invitations, already infrequent, dwindled further. My calls increasingly went to voicemail. Text messages received responses days later, if at all. I found myself checking social media only to discover events and gatherings I hadn't been told about: Thomas and Alexandra at gallery openings, charity benefits, even a 2-week vacation in Europe that I learned about only through posted photos. During one rare visit to their penthouse, Alexandra's hostility became more overt. When I mentioned missing Thomas, she cut me off sharply. "Thomas has responsibilities now, Jane. He can't be checking in on you constantly. His father prepared him for success, not babysitting." "I'm not asking to be babysat," I replied, fighting to keep my voice steady. "I'm asking to be included in my son's life." Alexandra's laugh was cold. "Included? You barely understand his world now. The people we socialize with, the circles we move in. Richard knew you wouldn't fit in. That's why he made the arrangements he did." I left that visit with tears streaming down my face, wondering if she was right. Had Richard seen something I had missed? Had I become an embarrassment to the successful man my son had become? As months passed, my health began showing signs of strain from the constant stress. I developed insomnia and high blood pressure conditions I kept to myself rather than burden Thomas further. I rationed my medications to reduce costs and cut back on expenses wherever possible. The house grew quieter and my world smaller as I found myself increasingly alone with grief and confusion. 6 months after Richard's death, I heard through a brief text message that Thomas had caught a bad cold. Without thinking twice, I spent the afternoon making his favorite chicken soup from scratch, just as I had done throughout his childhood. The familiar routine of chopping vegetables and simmering broth brought back memories of nursing Thomas through sick days, his grateful smile when I would bring a steaming bowl to his room. I called to let him know I was coming, but the call went to voicemail as usual. Still, I reasoned surely they wouldn't turn away a mother bringing soup to her ill son. I packaged the soup carefully, in insulated containers, and drove to their building. The doorman hesitated when I explained my purpose. "Mr. and Mrs. Williams didn't inform us of any expected visitors tonight, ma'am." "I'm his mother," I explained, holding up the bag of soup. "He's not feeling well. I won't stay long." After several phone calls and visible reluctance, the doorman finally allowed me upstairs. As the elevator rose to the penthouse floor, my stomach tightened with anxiety. The feeling of being an intruder in my own son's life was becoming distressingly familiar. When the elevator doors opened, I immediately knew something was wrong. Instead of a quiet apartment where someone was recuperating, I heard music, laughter, and the unmistakable sounds of a large gathering. For a moment, I considered returning to the lobby, but concern for Thomas pushed me forward. I rang the bell and a uniformed server answered, looking confused at my presence. Behind him, I could see at least 30 people in formal attire mingling in the expansive living room. Crystal glasses clinked, and elegant trays of hors d'oeuvres circulated through the crowd. "I'm here to see Thomas," I said, my voice nearly lost in the background noise. "I'm his mother." Before the server could respond, Alexandra appeared, her face transitioning from hostess smile to undisguised fury when she saw me. "Jane, what are you doing here?" she hissed, pulling me roughly to the side. "Thomas is sick. I brought soup," I explained, holding up my now ridiculous-seeming bag. Alexandra's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Sick? He's not sick. He's networking with the mayor and half the city council right now. This event has been planned for weeks." The lie about his illness hit me like a physical blow. Thomas had deliberately misled me, perhaps, to avoid an unwanted call or visit. "Let me at least say hello, since I'm here," I said, trying to maintain dignity. "Absolutely not. This is a crucial business event, not a family reunion." Alexandra's voice rose slightly, drawing the attention of nearby guests. "You can't just show up uninvited with your little homemade soup like we're some small-town family. Do you have any idea how this looks?" Thomas appeared, then his expression shifting from confusion to embarrassment when he saw me. "Mom, what are you doing here?" Before I could answer, Alexandra interjected. "She thinks you're sick. Brought soup, in the middle of our most important networking event of the season." The mocking tone in her voice made several nearby guests exchange glances. Thomas looked at the bag in my hands, and then around at the gathering, clearly calculating the social cost of my presence. "Mom, I'm fine. Just a small misunderstanding. Maybe we can talk tomorrow." His voice had the same tone he used when speaking to service workers, polite but distant. Alexandra wasn't satisfied with this gentle dismissal. Perhaps emboldened by alcohol or irritated by my interruption of her social triumph, she stepped closer to me. "You know what, Jane? This is perfect timing. I've been wanting to say this for months. That cabin, Richard left you. It fits you perfectly. You stinking old woman." The room fell silent, conversations halting mid-sentence, as heads turned toward the scene. "You've been clinging to Thomas, trying to guilt him into supporting you," she continued, her voice rising, "playing the victim card since Richard died. Did you think we didn't know how you manipulated him in his final days? How you've been trying to insert yourself into our lives at every turn?" Each accusation was more outrageous than the last, completely detached from reality. I looked to Thomas, expecting, hoping, praying for his intervention. But my son, my only child, whom I had loved and protected from his first breath, stood in silence, his eyes not meeting mine. "I have never asked for support," I said, my voice shaking. "I've only asked to be part of your lives. I've only wanted my son. Your son," Alexandra spat the words, "has moved beyond the small, shabby world you represent. Richard saw it. That's why he left you that worthless cabin while giving us everything of value." A woman nearby gasped at the cruelty, but no one intervened. Thomas shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. "I think it's time for you to leave," Alexandra said, her voice returning to a controlled public tone. "Security will escort you out." "Thomas," I looked directly at my son, tears blurring my vision. "Is this what you want?" He looked at me, then finally his expression, a mixture of guilt and resignation. "It's better if you go, Mom. We'll talk later." But we both knew later would never come. As a security guard from the building appeared at my elbow, I surrendered the bag of soup to a confused server and allowed myself to be escorted to the elevator. I held my head high, despite the tears streaming down my face, aware of the curious and pitying glances from the party guests. In the parking garage, I sat in my car for nearly an hour, sobbing until no more tears would come. The finality of the rupture between Thomas and me was impossible to deny. Whatever influence Alexandra held over him had completely erased the son I had raised. The boy who had brought me dandelions and burnt toast was gone, replaced by a man who would watch in silence as his mother was humiliated and ejected from his home. As I finally started the car to drive home, my hand brushed against something in my purse. It was the envelope Mr. Patterson had given me, months ago, still sealed. Inside were the keys to the cabin, along with a handwritten note. "Call me when you're ready to know more. Some journeys must be taken alone." In that moment of complete desolation, I made a decision. I had nowhere else to go, no one else to turn to. The cabin dismissed as worthless by Alexandra, and seemingly an afterthought by Richard, was the only thing left to me. I would go there, if only to escape the smothering grief of losing both my husband and son within a single year. With no plan beyond escape, I pointed my car toward the Blue Ridge Mountains and drove away from the glittering Miami skyline, away from the sun who no longer wanted me into an uncertain future that seemed as dark and lonely as the night road ahead. The drive to Blue Ridge Mountains took me through small towns and winding roads that seemed increasingly remote. My GPS signal faded in and out among the dense trees and mountain passes, causing me to take several wrong turns. By late afternoon, fatigue and emotional exhaustion were taking their toll, but I pushed forward, having nothing and no one to return to. I stopped at a local general store for directions, where a kind elderly man traced the final route on my map with a weathered finger. "That old Williams place ain't seen nobody up there in years, 'cept for that fella came regular these past few months. Doing work up there, I reckon." His words puzzled me, but I was too tired to ask questions. Following his directions, I finally turned onto a narrow gravel road that climbed steadily upward. The trees grew thicker, casting long shadows as the sun began its descent. After nearly a mile of rough terrain, the road opened to a small clearing. There sat the cabin largely as I remembered it from our brief visit decades ago. The exterior looked weathered and neglected, with missing roof shingles and peeling paint. A covered porch sagged slightly on one end. Alexandra's mocking words echoed in my mind. "That cabin fits you perfectly, you stinking old woman." Perhaps she was right. Perhaps this forgotten, neglected structure was indeed a fitting final chapter for me. Despite the cabin's appearance, the surrounding nature was breathtaking. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through towering pines. Wildflowers dotted the clearing, and somewhere nearby I could hear the gentle sound of running water. The air smelled of pine and earth, clean in a way city air never could be. I sat in my car for several minutes, gathering courage to approach what appeared to be a structure barely habitable. Finally, I retrieved the key from the envelope and walked slowly to the front door. The porch steps creaked under my weight, and the lock was stiff with rust and disuse. I had to lean my shoulder against the door as I turned the key, pushing against decades of settled wood. The door finally gave way, swinging inward with a groan of hinges. As the last rays of sunlight illuminated the interior, I froze in disbelief. Inside was nothing like the rustic, neglected cabin the exterior suggested. Instead, I stood at the threshold of a completely renovated, beautifully appointed home. The contrast was so jarring, I momentarily wondered if I had entered the wrong building. The main room featured a soaring ceiling, with exposed beams, polished hardwood floors, and a stone fireplace that anchored the space. Modern, comfortable furniture was arranged to take advantage of both the fireplace and the large windows overlooking the mountains. The kitchen, visible beyond an open dining area, gleamed with high-end stainless steel appliances and custom cabinetry. I moved forward in a daze, running my hand along a beautiful dining table that seated 8. The chairs were upholstered in a fabric that matched the throw pillows on the sofa, creating a cohesive designer look throughout the space. These weren't random selections. This was a carefully planned interior. As I explored further, my confusion deepened. The artwork on the walls featured landscapes I had admired in galleries over the years but never purchased. The bookshelf held titles by my favorite authors, many in the same editions I had mentioned wanting. Even the color scheme, a soothing palette of blues and greens, reflected preferences I had expressed over the years. In the bedroom, I found a quilt, nearly identical to one my grandmother had made, which had worn out years ago. On the nightstand sat a framed photograph of Richard and me on our honeymoon, a copy of which had been displayed in our bedroom at home. More photos lined the hallway. Thomas's graduation, our 25th anniversary trip, 4 generations of family at my father's 80th birthday. This wasn't a neglected inheritance or an afterthought. This was a home created specifically for me, filled with personal touches that only someone who knew me intimately would have included. On the dining table sat an envelope with my name written in Richard's distinctive handwriting. With trembling fingers, I opened it and began to read. My beloved Jane. If you're reading this, then everything has unfolded as I anticipated. I'm sorry for the confusion and pain you must have endured, but there was no other way to protect you. In my final years, I came to see Alexandra's true nature, and her influence over Thomas. She married him not for love, but for access to wealth and status. I watched as she gradually isolated him from his values, and from you. When my diagnosis came, I knew I needed to create a plan. The will reading was deliberately misleading. While Thomas did receive the Miami property and some visible assets, they come with conditions he doesn't yet know about. The cabin, however, is yours completely and unconditionally. I've spent the past year secretly renovating it to be the home we always talked about having in retirement. Behind the painting of the lake in the study, you'll find a safe. The combination is our wedding date. Inside is documentation of your true inheritance. A portfolio of investments in your name worth over $12 million. Ownership of several key properties, including the building housing Thomas's office, and detailed instructions for the financial advisor who will help you manage these assets. I did this not to punish Thomas, but to protect you from Alexandra's greed, and to give Thomas the chance to recognize her true character without the cushion of unlimited wealth. The Thomas we raised is still in there, I believe, beneath her influence. The cabin holds special significance for me. This land is where my father first brought me fishing as a boy. More importantly, though, few know this, it's where I first saw you. You were hiking with friends along the public trail that crosses the far edge of the property. I was helping my father clear brush and looked up to see the most beautiful woman I'd ever laid eyes on. I never told you this, but I purposely arranged our meeting at the university library 2 weeks later. It wasn't coincidence that brought us together, but my determination after seeing your smile on this very mountain. On the desk in the study, you'll find a tablet computer. Press the power button. I've loved you completely, Richard. Tears streamed down my face as I followed his instructions to the study, a beautiful room with a large desk overlooking a view of the mountains. The painting he mentioned hung on the wall, a serene lake scene that I now recognized as being visible from the property just beyond the trees. Behind it was indeed a safe. I entered our wedding date, and the door swung open to reveal folders of legal documents, property deeds, investment statements, and a thick binder labeled Jane's security plan. A quick glance confirmed everything Richard's letter had described. The tablet on the desk powered on immediately when I pressed the button. A video file was queued up with Richard's face frozen on the screen. I pressed play, and suddenly my husband was speaking to me from beyond the grave. "Hello, my darling," he began, looking thin but smiling that same smile that had captivated me for nearly 5 decades. "If you're watching this, you've discovered your real inheritance. The lawyers tell me I need to record this to prevent any challenges to my wishes, but really, I just wanted to see your face one more time." He explained in greater detail the arrangements he had made, occasionally pausing to cough or catch his breath. He had indeed left Thomas the Miami penthouse, but with a mortgage that would require Thomas to manage his finances carefully. The art and cars could be sold for immediate cash, but the investment portfolio had strict withdrawal limitations. "I'm not being cruel," Richard explained. "I'm giving our son the chance to become the man we raised him to be, not the accessory Alexandra wants. If he rises to the challenge, the restrictions ease. If not, at least you're protected." He ended the video looking directly into the camera, his eyes filled with the love I remembered. "Jane, you have been the joy of my life, my partner in everything. I couldn't bear the thought of leaving you vulnerable. This place is your sanctuary, for as long as you want it. Fill it with new friends, new purpose, new joy. My love for you doesn't end with my death. It continues in every detail of this home, every provision I've made for your future. Live well, my love. I'll be waiting." The video ended, and I sat in stunned silence as dawn broke over the mountains. Through the window, I could see the landscape illuminated in golden light, revealing a property more extensive than I had realized, with a small lake glittering in the distance. Birds began their morning songs, and for the first time since Richard's death, I felt something other than grief and abandonment. I felt his love surrounding me in this place he had created, as his final gift. The morning after my discovery, I called Mr. Patterson from the cabin's landline. He answered on the first ring, as if he'd been waiting for my call. "You found the letter," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, no accusation in my voice. only curiosity. Richard was explicit in his instructions. You needed to discover it yourself when you were ready. If I had told you immediately after the will reading, Alexandra would have found a way to manipulate the situation. Richard knew her too well by the end. Mr. Patterson arrived at the cabin that afternoon, bringing with him Richard's financial advisor, a woman named Sarah Jensen, who greeted me with genuine warmth. Over coffee at the dining table, they explained the full extent of Richard's arrangements. The cabin property isn't just this house, Sarah explained, spreading out a survey map. It's 200 acres of prime mountain land, including the lake and extensive road frontage. 3 different developers have already made inquiries about portions of the property. Richard was very specific that these decisions would be entirely yours, Mr. Patterson added. Sell, develop, preserve whatever you choose. The financial portfolio was diverse and carefully structured for both income and growth. You'll never have financial concerns again, Sarah assured me. Richard set everything up to generate monthly deposits to your account that will more than cover any expenses while the principal continues to grow. Most surprising was learning that Richard had been visiting the cabin regularly during the final year of his life, personally overseeing the renovation. He was very hands-on, Sarah said with a smile. He rejected 3 kitchen designs before finding one he thought you would love. The contractor said he'd never had a client so specific about details most people wouldn't notice. Over the following weeks, I began to settle into my new home and life. I explored the property, discovering walking trails, a small boathouse by the lake, and countless spots of natural beauty. The nearest town was small, but charming, with a close-knit community that quickly embraced me. I met neighbors who shared stories of Richard's frequent visits. Your husband was here almost every weekend for months, said Eleanor, who owned the property adjoining mine. Always checking on the construction, always pushing for it to be perfect. He told me it was a surprise for his wife of 45 years. The local contractor Richard had hired stopped by to check that everything was functioning properly. Mr. Williams was something else, he told me. Most clients give general ideas and let us handle details. He had specifications for everything from the height of the countertops to the exact shade of stain on the floors. Said it all had to be perfect for his Jane. As I grew more comfortable, I began adding my own touches to the home Richard had created. I planted a garden with help from Eleanor, who knew exactly what would thrive in the mountain soil. I arranged my books and personal treasures, making the space truly mine. 3 weeks after my arrival, Thomas called. The conversation began awkwardly with him, explaining that he needed a small loan for an investment opportunity. Apparently, he was discovering the limitations Richard had placed on his inheritance. I just need $100,000 temporarily, Mom. The funds in my portfolio are tied up in some legal restrictions Dad put in place. It's really inconvenient. For the first time in our relationship, I set a firm boundary. I'm not in a position to provide loans, Thomas. Your father structured your inheritance the way he did for specific reasons. I suggest you work within those parameters. But Mom, his voice took on the wheedling tone. Alexandra often used, "This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I'll pay you back in 3 months guaranteed." I'm sorry, Thomas. My answer is no. The strength in my voice surprised even me. 2 days later, my phone exploded with calls and texts. Thomas had apparently discovered that I, through one of Richard's companies, owned the building housing his office. More importantly, the company had just issued notices of a significant rent increase to all tenants, including Thomas's firm. Alexandra called too, her tone dramatically different from our last encounter. Jane, we've been so worried about you disappearing to that remote cabin. Thomas and I would love to have you visit soon. Perhaps this weekend. We're having a small dinner party with some people I know you'd enjoy meeting. The transparency of her sudden warmth would have been amusing if it weren't so sad. Thank you for the invitation, Alexandra, but I'm quite comfortable here. The cabin has turned out to be exactly what I needed. But surely you're lonely all the way out there, she pressed. And with winter coming, it must be concerning to be so isolated. We have that lovely guest suite just sitting empty. Richard made sure I have everything I need, I replied, enjoying the momentary silence that followed. Yes, about Richard's arrangements. Alexandra's voice shifted to businesslike. Thomas has discovered some strange restrictions in his inheritance. We're wondering if you found any similar issues with yours. Any paperwork that might help clarify his situation. I found exactly what Richard intended me to find, I answered truthfully, and I suggest Thomas do the same. The calls became more frequent, as Thomas and Alexandra realized the extent of Richard's planning. The rent increase was just the beginning. As Thomas attempted to sell some of the artwork to generate cash, he discovered provisions requiring approval from the estate trustee Mr. Patterson. When he tried to take a loan against the penthouse, he learned of restrictions there as well. Meanwhile, I was building a new life. With help from Mr. Patterson, I established a foundation focused on supporting elderly people facing family estrangement and financial insecurity. I used a portion of my resources to create programs that provided both practical help and community connection for people in situations similar to what I had feared facing. The mountain community embraced both me and the foundation's work. I hosted gatherings at the cabin which proved perfect for entertaining, with its spacious layout and beautiful setting. I made genuine friends who valued me for myself, not for status or financial support. 6 months after my arrival, Thomas appeared at my door unannounced. He looked tired with dark circles under his eyes, and less of the polished perfection I had grown accustomed to seeing. "Can we talk?" he asked, standing uncertainly on the porch that no longer sagged thanks to repairs I had commissioned. I invited him in, watching as he took in the beautiful interior with evident surprise. "This isn't what I expected," he admitted, following me to the kitchen where I had been baking bread. "Your father was full of surprises," I replied, pouring us both coffee. Thomas sat at the counter, turning the mug in his hands. "Alexandra doesn't know I'm here," he said finally. "Things haven't been good between us lately. She's frustrated by the financial restrictions, blames me for not finding ways around them." "And what do you think?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. He looked up, really seeing me, perhaps for the first time in years. "I think Dad knew exactly what he was doing. I've been looking back, remembering things. How she gradually pulled me away from family events. How she would make comments about you when you weren't around. How everything became about appearances and connections." He swallowed hard. "I've been a fool, Mom. And worse than that, I've been cruel to the person who has always loved me unconditionally." It wasn't the complete reconciliation I might have dreamed of, but it was a beginning. Thomas stayed for dinner, asking questions about the cabin, the community, and my new projects. As he was leaving, he hugged me tightly, something he hadn't done in years. "I'm going to fix things, Mom. I don't know how yet, but I will." As his car disappeared down the gravel road, I stood on the porch, breathing in the mountain air and feeling Richard's presence all around me. He had known that money and status couldn't permanently change the son we had raised together. He had created a path for both Thomas and me to find our way back to what truly mattered. 1 year after discovering the cabin, my life had transformed in ways I never could have imagined during those dark days following Richard's death. The cabin had evolved from a symbol of rejection to the heart of my new beginning. I had expanded the garden to include a greenhouse where I could grow vegetables year-round. The lake had a new dock where I often sat in the evenings watching the sunset paint the water in gold and crimson. The renovation Richard had overseen was indeed perfect, but I had added my own touches: a pottery studio in what had been a storage building, bird feeders that attracted a colorful array of mountain species, and paths through the woods marked with benches at particularly beautiful vantage points. This was now truly my home, not just Richard's final gift. My foundation had grown beyond my initial vision. What began as a support service for elderly people facing family estrangement had expanded to include legal advocacy, social connections, and even housing assistance. The work gave me purpose and connected me to people with similar experiences and resilient spirits. I hosted regular gatherings at the cabin, from foundation events to simple potluck dinners with neighbors and new friends. The dining table that had initially seemed too large for just me now frequently accommodated 8 or more people, filled with conversation and laughter. Eleanor from next door had become my closest friend, her practical wisdom and dry humor a daily blessing. Thomas had kept his word about trying to fix things. 3 months after his surprise visit, he and Alexandra separated. The process was neither quick nor easy. Alexandra fought bitterly against the prenuptial agreement Richard had wisely insisted upon, claiming Thomas had hidden assets and deceived her about his wealth. The irony wasn't lost on any of us that she was accusing him of exactly what she had done throughout their marriage. Thomas stood firm, supported by Mr. Patterson and the legal protections Richard had put in place. When the divorce was finally settled, Alexandra received far less than she had expected and moved back to New York, where I heard she was already pursuing another wealthy prospect. Thomas began visiting the cabin regularly, sometimes staying for a weekend, occasionally longer. Our relationship healed gradually through honest conversations and shared moments that reminded us of the bond we had before Alexandra's influence. He helped me build raised garden beds, laughing as we covered ourselves in soil and making the same jokes he had as a boy, helping me plant tomatoes in our first home. "Dad really did think of everything," Thomas remarked once, as we sat on the dock, fishing poles in hand, though we rarely caught anything. "He knew Alexandra would show her true colors if the money wasn't unlimited. He knew you would thrive here, not just survive. And he knew I would eventually find my way back to what matters." The financial restrictions on Thomas's inheritance had begun to ease as he demonstrated the responsibility and values Richard had hoped to see. He had restructured his business to focus more on community development projects, similar to Richard's early work, finding meaning beyond profit margins. One evening, as I hosted a foundation fundraiser at the cabin, I found myself standing on the porch looking out at the gathering. Inside, donors and community members mingled in the beautiful space Richard had created. Outside, the mountains stood silhouetted against a star-filled sky. I felt a profound sense of gratitude for this unexpected chapter of my life. Eleanor joined me, offering a glass of wine. "Penny, for your thoughts?" "I was just thinking about journeys," I replied. "How sometimes what looks like an ending is actually a beginning. How loss can eventually lead to gain if you're open to it." "Richard would be proud," she said, simply having heard enough of my story to understand its complexity. "I think he knew," I said, sipping my wine. "I think he saw further down the path than any of us could." Later that night, after the guests had departed and the cabin was quiet again, I sat in Richard's study looking at our wedding photo on the desk. The anger and hurt that had once consumed me had gradually transformed into understanding and eventual peace. Alexandra's cruel words, "That cabin fits you perfectly, you stinking old woman," now seemed almost comical in their irony. The cabin did fit me perfectly because it was created with love by the person who knew me best. Life had taught me lessons I never expected to learn in my 7th decade. That material wealth means nothing compared to authentic relationships, that it's never too late to start a new chapter. That standing firm in your own worth is not selfishness but self-preservation. That forgiveness doesn't require forgetting or enabling further harm. Thomas came for dinner the following Sunday, bringing photos of a community center his company was helping to build. As we shared a meal at the table Richard had so carefully chosen, I felt the presence of the past and the promise of the future converging in a moment of perfect contentment. The cabin, once presented as a consolation prize, had become the foundation of a rich, meaningful life I couldn't have imagined a year earlier. Through Richard's foresight and love, what Alexandra had intended as an insult had become my greatest blessing. Have you ever experienced a situation where what initially seemed like a loss turned into an unexpected gift? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if you found meaning in my journey, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories of resilience and renewal. Remember to share with someone who might need to be reminded that endings often contain the seeds of beautiful beginnings. Thank you for spending this time with me, and may you find peace and purpose in your own journey wherever it leads.